Chapter 31 Gerudo Town. Gerudo Town's front gate opened up directly into the plaza round which the market was situated. Outside of that gate, the city gave off a low hum, though one could not have said what that was. But once the gate was crossed, that hum rose into the dull roar of voices. Zelda had expected that stall owners would be calling out, hawking their wares, and certainly some were, but by and large each woman selling in the square was seated behind a spread of goods, relaxed, allowing the fruits of her labor or her land to speak for themselves. Most of the voices were from the crowds, Gerudo, yes, but also Rito and Hylian women, chatting in singles or in loose groups that shifted and moved like eddies of water. Many stands were set up for the selling of food, be it rich-looking meat or fruit meant to fight the heat of the day, but others caught her eye more insistently. "Hiya," she said, tugging on her friend's sleeve as if she needed to get her attention.
"Let's head over to that one in the corner. I think they're selling arrows."
Pai's eyes were wide and she looked as if she might bolt. Zelda understood. Instantly, the Shaker Guild had never been around this many people in her entire life, certainly not packed so closely together. This was worlds removed from the quiet of Kakariko village, and an order of magnitude fuller than Zora's domain or Goron City had been. It was nearly a wall of voices and faces, squashing flat those who did not know how to move through it. Pai's relationship with the bodies of other people had been tenuous or tumultuous for a long time, Zelda had gathered, and this place would put her to the test. Still.
"Listen."
She gripped Pai's hand directly.
"It will be all right. You will be all right. We need to restock on our arrows, but that's all we're going to do. We'll leave a wide berth around the crowds, make our way over to that stall, get our supplies, and then we'll go somewhere quiet to recover. I think there's an inn nearby. Would that be okay?"
Pai might have blushed, but it was hard to tell under the shade of her hat.
Why, you don't need to do that, Delta. I'll be all right. It's just a little noise. From a lot of people. Well, I'm glad you would be able to take it, but I wouldn't. So,
the truth was, Zelda couldn't bear to make Pai pit discomfort against the duty to keep an eye on her at all times. Making the girl even think about that choice would have been cruel in the extreme.
It will only be a moment. Anyway, let's go.
As through the lost woods, Zelda led Pai by the hand. True to her word, she took them in a wide arc around the noisiest and most energetic parts of the crowd, cutting through the center of the plaza wherever they could. That center held fewer tourists than the edges of the plaza. Those few people moving through were primarily Gerudo, some wearing enormous packs on their backs in preparation for some long journey. A few smiled and greeted them, in Hylian or Gerudo, and a few more paid no mind at all. Zelda was not used to handling crowds any more familiarly than Pai was. The difference was that she had the force of will and sense of self-importance, and that's what it was. She could admit it to herself. To stop, look at the backs of the women there gathered, observe how they moved, and then copy it. She made a beeline for the Fletcher's stall, slipping between shoulders and sides where she could, gently forcing people apart to make room for Pai where she had to. She muttered thanks or apologies, where appropriate, and her grip on Pai's hand was unshakable. She couldn't look back to make sure Pai was okay. They had to reach the stall first. All at once they broke through, and the proprietor looked up at them with an expectant but pleased expression. Zelda took the opportunity to look back at Pai, who was plainly frazzled but nodded that she was okay, before releasing her hand and turning her attention back to business.
"Savak,"
Zelda said, and the owner's eyes lit up with amusement that shifted into genuine surprise when the Hylian girl continued in technically proficient, if stilted, Gerudo.
"We would like to purchase multiple arrows, please."
"I'm sure you would," the owner replied in Gerudo, nodding.
"Your wording isn't exactly natural, but your accent is very good. Where did you learn, little sister?"
"Here," Zelda said, sweeping her hand toward the plaza.
"When I was small. I have forgotten much." "You remember enough, I think. I see by your friend's expression she doesn't have the same background. You should take care of her. She looks so nervous."
The woman leaned forward. She was so tall, her arms so long, that she easily reached across the display of her arrows and patted Pai gently on the arm, as if she were soothing a child. Then, in Hylian,
"Do not worry, baby, no one here is going to bite you. Gerudo Town is very good for tourists. Very safe." Thank you. I'm sorry.
Pai bowed, deep, apparently collecting herself.
I'm just not very good with crowds. Please ignore my rudeness, and do not think you need to speak Hylian on my account. My companion so rarely has an opportunity to practice speaking Gerudo with anyone, and it makes me very happy to listen to her do so, even if I don't understand the words.
Fiona looked at Paya, then nodded.
As you say, little sister.
Then she turned back to Zelda and she scowled before continuing in Gerudo.
I hope you appreciate how good a friend you have. I do appreciate her. I promise. Well, you'd better. Anyway, time for business. You say you were looking for arrows. I have the best in the entire region. See, here, look at these thunder arrows. Thunder magic itself is as much of the desert as it is of clouds, so
It went on that way for a little while as they worked out the best elements of each of the arrow types and their specific uses. The owner surprised Zelda, not in her knowledge of the craft of magical fletching, which was comprehensive, but in how strong her opinions were about the relative usefulness of each kind of arrow, and how they worked together. One couldn't travel in the Gerudo Highlands without plenty of fire arrows, for instance, and walking through the desert without ice arrows and thunder arrows was asking for all kinds of trouble. They discussed the interconnection between the elements, how well each kind worked in different climates against different kinds of monsters, or wildlife, but they were not talking about hunting, and how many it was good to have of each kind. The woman was pushing for Zelda to buy up a significant portion of her stock based on the way she talked. She rarely had a customer as enthusiastic as she had right now, and she wanted to capitalize on that rare opportunity. She offered Zelda a 5% discount. Zelda talked her into taking off 10% in exchange for buying every arrow. There was a lot of smiling and laughing and shaking of hands. Then Zelda did not use her goddess awareness during this exchange, would not think to for a little while yet. Opening herself up in a place that crowded felt like asking for trouble, and she felt safe in Gerudo Town, safe in a way that she had not felt since leaving the Great Plateau. She would have been able to recognize why. If she had chosen to pull back her perspective and really think about the way she was feeling, she would have been able to say that she was connecting with a part of herself that went deeper than memory, the very foundation of her sense of being that had been laid in her childhood. If she had possessed her memory, she might have reflected that she felt close to her mother, walking through that town that her mother had loved. But she had none of these things, not her memory, not a moment for quiet introspection, and not an inkling that she should use the power of Hylia. She was not aware of the eyes that were watching as she and Paya moved through the crowd.
You're really enjoying yourself,
Paya said from behind her, and something in her tone made Zelda wonder. She looked over her shoulder. Paya had insisted that she was all right, that she would be able to keep up in the crowds and didn't need to be led, and tried to read the shaken woman's face. Paya looked bright, even cheery, which must have been a considerable effort with the amount of noise and the number of bodies that they had just pressed through.
Aren't you? Yes, I suppose I am. I know this must be exhausting. I'm sorry for my selfishness. Still. Yes, I am.
Paya inclined her head.
Please do not apologize. Seeing you so animated, so engaged, it makes me happy, too. I feel like I'm seeing a part of you I haven't seen before. I'm engaged often. Yes, you are. With learning about the Guardians, or the past, or your duties. What?
Paya looked about.
That looks like a quiet spot.
They had pulled away from the larger crowds of the market as they made their way toward the inn recommended by the Fletcher. The gap in feeling, separated only by meters, was pronounced. In one moment they had been surrounded by people on all sides, and in the next they had broken away so that the roar of voices slowly faded. There were more people ahead of them, near the inn, though not nearly so many as were outside the clothing shop across the plaza. It was only here, in this one space, where things were quiet. Across from them, marking the spot where people did not gather because there was nothing to interest them, was a shop, and unless Zelda was reading incorrectly, it was called Starlight Memories. She had no idea what they could be selling, based on the name. Standing outside of the doorway was a tall Gerudo who paced back and forth, hand cupped under her chin while she thought very hard about something. Zelda found herself taken aback by how well the woman was dressed. From the ornamentation in her hair to the cufflinks on her wrists, whoever she was, she practically glowed.
You would like to continue speaking in a shop?
Zelda asked.
It looks like no one's browsing the shop's wares at the moment,
Paya said.
I know I said I'm alright with crowds, and I am, but it might be nice to spend a few minutes in the quiet, before we make the push to the inn. Of course, we will do just that. Then, I must admit, I could use a bit of quiet myself.
They approached the store, and in spite of their closeness, the woman standing outside of it did not acknowledge them, did not seem to even see them. She was deeply preoccupied, whatever she was thinking about, and if it had not been for Zelda's natural curiosity, call it nosiness if you must, combined with an unfailing politeness, then they would not have bothered her at all.
Savok?
Zelda said as they made to pass her.
Savok?
The woman replied, then blinked, then looked at them, then scowled in a way that did not wrinkle her forehead. Then she continued in Hylian.
Great. You got the last of my free time with that greeting. Oh,
Zelda replied, in Gerudo.
I apologize. No, none of that.
The woman continued, still scowling, still in Hylian.
I speak Gerudo all the time. Let me practice my Hylian with you. You will get plenty of opportunity to practice in the city.
Zelda inclined her head.
Of course. Please excuse my rudeness. I did not mean to trouble you.
The woman inhaled through her mouth and exhaled through her nose.
No, I apologize. I have let my stress affect how I treat strangers. Please pay me no mind, my problems are mine. What's the matter?
Pai asked, volunteering a question to a stranger for the first time that day. The woman nodded to her.
It is not something that should bother you, but you are gracious enough to ask, so I'll tell you. My name is Isha. I manage a shop that specializes in handmade accessories, but I've run out of flint. I need it to make my items. Flint?
That took Zelda back. It occurred to her, as the word left her mouth, that she knew very little about how things were made, generally speaking.
Yes.
Isha continued.
I work with topaz, rubies, sapphires, even diamonds, when I have them. But the act of cutting the gems, setting them in jewelry, measuring them, polishing them, all of these things require flint. I'm out of stock, and no one in the city seems to have any, either.
She held one perfectly manicured hand over her eyes, as if to hide her face, and then continued in a lower voice.
It's starting to look like I'm going to have to go to the Highlands with a hammer and mine for some myself.
Zelda and Pai exchanged glances, eyebrows raised. Well, Isha wasn't looking. Then Zelda said,
We've been traveling for some time, and I often stop to do a bit of mining at ore deposits. If it's flint you need, we've built up a considerable stockpile and would be happy to give you whatever amount you require.
Isha lowered her hand, stared at the two girls.
Truly? Yes, of course. We have been out of flint for days. The delay in product was going to start affecting business. You are doing me a greater service than you know. All right. Will the two of you come inside, please? I'd like to discuss your payment.
Before Zelda could say they required nothing, Isha had already turned and taken long, flowing, elegant steps into the shop, disappearing through the doorway. And, beating Zelda to the bunch a second time in as many moments, Pai said,
We were going to go in anyway, and it will still be much quieter than the plaza.
They followed Isha inside. Out of the light of the sun it was instantly cooler, as if they had entered into another climate entirely. The light streaming in through the windows kept the shop well lit, even more than the torches that hung along the walls, and the cases of jewelry sparkled in that light. Zelda did not know much about jewelry. She suspected that she never really had, and that she had made few decisions about her appearance herself, but she could still see how finely crafted each piece was. There was a sapphire-set tiara where the filigree reminded her of Zora architecture. She handed over the flint to Isha, who took it to another woman in the back, Kara, before returning to them. Up close, in the confines of the shop, Zelda was taken aback all over again by Isha's appearance, from the careful ties of her hair to the diadem she wore to everything. She exuded a kind of cultivated elegance, and not of someone who meant to communicate wealth or power, but that of someone who loved beauty for beauty's own sake. She may have been the most striking woman Zelda had ever seen.
Since you have done so much to help my shop,
Isha said,
I would like to make a piece of jewelry for you. You will need to provide the raw materials, but I will not charge you for the setting or for the labor, so you incur no cost out of pocket.
Zelda blinked up at Isha, stunned.
That is very generous.
Isha smiled, the turn of her lips a small and pretty change.
Do not think too well of me. You have done me a better service than you can know. Now, please, look at the pieces I have on display here. Save for the diamond circlet. If you have the materials to make them, then I will make one fitted for you.
Zelda and Paya moved between the jewel cases together, stopping at each of them, talking in low voices about the potential benefits of the different gems. They did not step over to the diamond circlet, though Zelda did take in the price associated. It only made sense that he was excluding that one. 1,500 rupees of labor was a lot to just give away.
The amber earrings are very nice,
Paya said.
They're said to strengthen the body as effectively as heavy armor. I'm sure that's true,
Zelda replied,
but I can't help thinking they might be made redundant by the armor Robbie made. The opal earrings are the same weight, moving more quickly through water sounds very nice, but could they fill that function as well as the Zora armor?
She shook her head.
I think it's down to the circlets. I agree. Still, the question is, which one? I believe we can eliminate the ruby for now. It might be useful when moving through a colder climate, but we have a lot of experience in that, and it's much cheaper and easier to cook for warmth than it is for coolness. The Fletcher mentioned that the monsters roaming the desert tend to align with lightning, like the chews we found outside of town, and insulation against electricity could prove a boon.
In truth, she was looking to Paya for advice. In spite of the fact that she had seen somewhat more of the world than her companion, Zelda still felt less familiar with how to move through it than Paya did. Even if it were only through the preparation of education, Zelda thought of Paya as a kind of authority. The princess could make decisions when she needed to, but she trusted her attendant implicitly. It is a lucky thing that her companion was keyed in on this small dependence. I think, Paya said, that the best way to deal with any foe who wields lightning is the same way we deal with foes who wield the other elements. Or none, do not fight them directly, and do not give them an opportunity to use their powers. We can circumvent a Lizalfos that wields lightning. We cannot circumvent the heat of the day. Zelda nodded, then turned back to Isha.
May I have one of the sapphire circlets, please? I have the sapphires here.
She reached into her pouch, dug out the requisite gems, and handed them to the jeweler.
It will be my pleasure. An excellent choice, too. You look like you might be traveling through the heat quite a lot. Do you have anything appropriate to wear over it? Your hood looks too warm, and in the warmer parts of the desert it may actually counteract the effects of the circlet.
Zelda blinked, slightly taken aback. She didn't have an immediate answer.
Will the circlet not suffice on its own? On its own? Do you mean to walk into the desert with it, barehead? Well,
she started, and then got no further.
Damn that Sola. This is her fault. Her and the Hylian by running around in that costume like she's playing dress up. No, it will not suffice. Look at your skin.
She leaned forward, grabbed Zelda's hand, and held it up to be examined. Zelda had never been made aware of how pale she was until that moment. She had barely tanned at all since leaving the Great Plateau, being more or less completely covered from the sun at all times, and next to the rich depth of Isha's skin her hand looked almost ghostly.
And I know what you are thinking. Oh, it is because I am pale. But no, it is because you are Hylian. Even if you were of darker skin than me, you could not go out into the desert with a bare head. Do you know why? Sunburn. Sunburn, she says, as if describing the calamity as a piglet. Listen, Gerudo are like the sand. Our skin is impervious to the sun, like the Gorons. It is why we can dress as we do. The Rito are protected by their plumage. But Hylians and Zora, the sunlight passes through you as if you were made of glass, and it cooks you more effectively than steam. You contend not only with the heat of the desert, but also the very light of the day, which will make the flesh fall from your bones. And this,
she gestured to Zelda's very good, very sturdy tunic, which made Zelda look down at it,
will not do either.
Zelda lifted her head, feeling the first stirrings of defensiveness.
This tunic has served me very well. No longer. You need something that is light and doesn't make so much direct contact with your skin. Look at your friend. Her outfit is much better, though she should be wearing full gloves. Kara.
Kara's voice from the back of the shop was, mostly, disinterested sounding.
Get my measuring tape ready. We need to get...
Isha stopped, then looked down hard at her customer.
What is your name? Delta. And my companion is Paya. We need to get Zelda fitted for a new outfit. And a circlet. Right away. Wait a moment,
Zelda said, holding up her hands, as if to slow down proceedings that she clearly had no more control over.
Even if I wanted a new outfit, and I do not, wouldn't I get my measurements taken at a specialist shop?
Isha scoffed.
Saul is an excellent seamstress, but she is an awful tailor. You go to her first, and she will try to dress you like a tourist in some gaudy outfit that barely fits. I will send you to her with a note from me, with proper measurements, and you will be outfitted appropriately, whether you like it or not.
Zelda set her feet wide and glared up at Isha, who responded by putting her fists on her hips and cocking an eyebrow. The princess counted to 5 in her head. This woman was presuming too much, by far, and to think that she would be bullied, especially with regards to clothes, was a notion she would need to be disabused of. She could feel the anger bubbling inside of her, waiting to burst out, and she thought of how it would be to give Isha a piece of her mind and march out, and then inevitably go into the desert later, less than perfectly prepared. She sighed, and then she put on her best smile, a shift in expression that made Isha flinch.
That is a wonderful offer. I think I will take you up on it.
The jeweler nodded, somewhat more reserved now.
Of course. Come with me into the back, then.
She turned and walked, and Zelda followed the jeweler. The princess had gone 3 steps when she looked over her shoulder and realized she was leaving her friend by herself.
I'll be back in a few minutes, Paya.
Zelda tried to alleviate Paya's nerves with a smile, was unsure of how well it worked.
Or at least, that's the hope. You should spend some time looking at the accessories here. We have enough money to spare to get one made for you, so I want you to look at them carefully. All right?
Blessed with a task, Paya nodded in return.
Yes, I will do just that. Then, while I wait for your return.
Zelda looked back at Paya again as she went to the back room. The Sheikah woman was looking very hard at the jewelry cases, absorbed in her assigned task. It was a matter of some debate among the Sheikah exactly how much effect training could have on the senses, on a person's ability to react to sudden danger or changes in the environment. That training mattered was clear and undisputed fact. The issue was whether or not natural talent mattered. There was a sizable faction, in which Paya's grandmother counted herself a member, that argued that training was all that mattered in questions of mastery. Differences in natural ability only determined the starting point for the servants of the royal family, not their end point. In fact, there might not be an end point at all. This was what the Sheikah of 10,000 years ago had forgotten, in seeking to build technology that could rival the gods, and it was what the Yiga had forgotten even now. The depths of the shadows were bottomless, and so too were the depths of mastery one might attain. Paya had often heard it argued, when she was small, that she must have had a great deal of natural talent. She was the granddaughter of the revered Impa, after all, who had survived the calamity and then continued her service for a century beyond that. That she should be capable of great things was expected, regardless of how meek and shy she had been as a child. Her training had initially rebuffed that assumption. Her meekness of character translated into a meekness of the body. Normal training proved to be too much for her, and Dorian, who had been in charge of the youngest trainees at the time, had lamented that the expectations of the tribe might be too heavy for her. That was when her grandmother had taken her under her wing. Paya thought about that day a lot, the first time she had been told she would be training under the illustrious Impa. And even back then she'd understood how great the pressure was, compounded on top of the shame of not being able to keep up with her peers. She cried in front of her grandmother, hadn't been able to stop herself for long minutes, and Impa had sat and waited patiently. When the tears stopped flowing, her grandmother promised her one thing, that she would never demand more than Paya was capable of. For more than a decade she had held to that promise. For more than a decade she had taken a soft-hearted girl and turned her into a soft-hearted woman whose hands were as good as blades, and whose senses were no less sharp. Paya did not hear it, exactly, when a woman entered the shop behind her on silent feet. She was concentrating very hard on the amber earrings, thinking that they seemed to be the best supplement to her skills and equipment, so she did not see the gentle shadow that passed over the floor, out of her line of sight. Perhaps she felt the air shift behind her, reading the currents of the wind as it flowed through the hairs on the back of her neck. Perhaps she felt vibrations through the floor as the stranger stepped, silent but unable to hide the reality of her shifting weight. Perhaps she felt the aggressive intent as it descended on her. Later, she would not be able to say why she knew that the woman was there, she simply did. The woman made a grab for her from behind, Paya ducked so that the reaching hands closed on empty air. As she rose, Paya grabbed the jewelry case, tore it loose from its fittings, turned, and swung the display into the side of the woman's head. The world slowed down. Wood splintered and glass shattered in a storm of noise that filled the shop. Somewhere in the back, Kara and Isha and especially Zelda were shouting, but Paya did not hear them clearly. The amber earrings twinkled prettily in the light of the sun filtering through the door. The woman was studiously plain-looking, with dyed brown hair tied in a simple bun and a dress that would not have stood out in a crowd. Her face was twisted in a snarl, her eyes squeezed shut just before the impact, protecting her from the shards of glass that spun in the air. Her left hand was slack, still reaching, while her right hand was partially open, a red orb the size of Paya's pinky nail falling from it. The force of the case being smashed into the assassin's head had knocked her off balance, but she was bleeding only very little from the temple, the spot where Paya had struck her. More, Paya realized. The woman was not really bleeding. There was no blood. Malice rose out of the wound like evil smoke. Oh Hylia, she prayed, and Zelda's face was in her mind. The world sped back up. Paya struck her attacker in the eyes, the throat, the chest, hitting deep on vital points that should have incapacitated her or killed, but the feedback was wrong. The feeling under her knuckles didn't have enough give. The woman, blinded but recovering, reached for her again, hands crooked into claws. Paya stepped inside her reach, grabbed the woman by the right shoulder and the fabric near the left hip, pivoted, and spun the woman around once before hurling her bodily out the door and into the street. The Shaker drew her sword, bunched her legs under her, and gathered her strength. The eager woman hit the ground on her back, flipped, and landed on her feet, now in the full regalia of her order. The shine of her white mask was temporarily darkened under a shadow cast by her discarded dress falling through the air. When the dress blocked her from view, Paya leaped across the distance between them. The eager woman's senses were no sharper than training allowed, and Shaker training had advanced for 100 centuries after the Yaga had stagnated. She did not react in time when Paya's sword plunged through the dress and then into her chest. Malice exploded out of the wound like a geyser, its heat and its corrosive evil scalding Paya's hands as her weight and her momentum brought the Yaga crashing down onto her back. Gloved hands reached up, grabbing at Paya's face as if to claw at her, grasping empty air. Paya watched, unbreathing, as the force of the other woman's struggles weakened, slowed, ceased.
Guards! Guards! Yaga! A Yaga inside the walls! Where are the guards? By the 7. Did you see that? That girl. She.
With one hand Paya held the sword in place, to keep it still against the dying force of the malice seeking to push it free. With the other she reached down, reached behind her opponent's head, loosened the fasteners that held the assassin's mask in place. Gently, as gently as she would handle a child, she lifted the mask away. People were gathering, now, their voices filling the air around her in a cacophony that would drown out the music of the gods. If she focused, she might be able to count how many voices there were around her, daughters and mothers and grandmothers and aunts and cousins. She might be able to tell what they were saying, picking out conversations from the tapestry of noise. That she could have done so occupied a theoretical space in some dark, isolated corner of her brain. That crowd wasn't real. The people might as well have not existed. The face of her attacker no longer bled malice. A thin line of crimson trailed from her temple. Another led from the corner of her mouth, staining her lips that same color red. Her teeth, chin. Paya stared for a long time at her teeth before moving on the rest of her face. Her disguise had made her look like any Hylian woman, but Paya could see the shining silver at the roots of her hair, at the bright red irises peeking out from under colored lenses. Those eyes stared openly at the sky, and looking at her, seeing her as she really was, Paya imagined that this girl could have been Shaker. They might have been raised together, Eden. And she was dead. Paya had killed her.
Paya? Paya.
Zelda's voice cracked, calling for her. I have frightened the princess, she thought. She looked up, set the mask on the ground, stepped away from the body, went to meet her charge. There was a great deal of motion and talking. Then, as the guard arrived a minute late and tried to bring order back to the situation, cordoning off the Yaga's body and directing the crowd away from it, Something about the presence of that body agitated the guards, making them both angry and wary, but Zelda couldn't guess at what the source of that was. The guards wouldn't have noticed her at all except that Paya stuck to her now, and the guards all had their eyes on Paya. Isha had moved from fury over the destruction of her display to an even deeper fury that the Yiga assassin had found their way inside the city walls, and then inside of her very shop, threatening her customers and herself. There was no one to vent that fury to, so she stood outside the door of her shop, arms crossed, her expression daring anyone to approach her and question her. The gods would, in time, but surely they'd regret the approach. Kara was humming tunelessly on the opposite side of the door, as if nothing in particular had happened. No one moved to clean up the mess. There might be something important in the middle of the ruin shards. Afternoon turned to evening. The body was taken away. The crowd dispersed of its own accord, and at last two gods approached Paya and Zelda. They were tall, broad women, heavily muscled, carrying spears to scale with their height. In spite of their obvious power and weapons training, Zelda noticed that they exchanged nervous glances while approaching.
"The two of you," the one on the left said, her Hylian slow and precise, "we're at the center of this incident."
Paya's expression had changed very little since the fight. She didn't show fatigue, fear, or wrath. Anything that Zelda would have expected. Perhaps she was in shock. Zelda recalled how she had felt a century ago, the first time she had seen a person die. How much worse must it have been for Paya, who had driven home the sword with her own hands. But she'd reacted normally to conversation, had seemed stern as she kept all of her senses trained on the outside world, keeping vigil against the appearance of more Yiga. She'd returned to some semblance of normalcy almost instantly. "Still," Zelda replied first.
"My friend was attacked,"
she said.
"In my shop,"
Isha said. "Inside the city walls," hung in the air.
"Yes,"
the guard replied, her sigh rippling the fabric of her veil.
"There is no doubt that she was only defending herself. Frankly, anyone who kills one of the Yiga is doing us an immense favor."
She turned specifically toward Paya.
"Still, if you are well enough, we have some questions. If possible, we want to better understand what happened here."
She waved her hand at the now vacant spot where the body had lain.
"Not the fight. What came before that?"
Zelda was about to speak on Paya's behalf again. Surely the authorities could wait a day before getting a statement, when the Sheikah spoke up.
"Of course. If you'll allow, I would be happy to explain what took place."
Zelda looked at Paya as the gods looked at each other. Paya's expression was still neutral, leaning toward warm, not unlike when Zelda had first seen her in Kakariko village. She could tell what Paya was feeling, absolutely and without question, if she called on Hylia's power, but that felt like an invasion. Now, they would talk about it later. They would come in, if it would help.
"Certainly,"
the guard said.
"We should probably talk inside of the shop."
The six of them entered together. Between the two guards, Isha, Kara, Paya, and Zelda, the front of the shop felt crowded, but only Paya actually stepped into the midst of the debris, glass and wood crunching underneath her feet. The other five kept a respectful distance, backs to the wall where they had space.
"She came in behind me here,"
Paya said, standing in front of the place where the amber earrings had been displayed.
"I was examining the jewelry, trying to decide which would be most useful on our journey, when I felt her reaching."
She pivoted forward at the waist, then held her hands in the air as if grabbing hold of the now-gone case.
I ducked beneath her grab, then hit her with the display case. I was able to force her outside. "It's a wonder you didn't kill her at the first blow."
Every eye turned to Kara, who shrugged.
"They're good cases. Heavy. You reduced one to splinters. If you hit me that hard with one, I don't think I'd get back up."
"Me neither," said the second god, speaking for the first time. Paya shrugged. Nobody else had seen the malice. The only reason Zelda had known was that she could feel it hanging in the air afterward. Zelda still didn't know what to think of that, what the presence of malice meant, but she knew it was why the Yiga had lasted so long against Paya. Why Paya had been forced to kill.
"The assassin's art includes many kinds of training,"
Paya said.
"I am of the Sheikah, and many of the Yiga arts are derived from ours. So I recognize certain techniques."
She turned, knelt in the glass, gently moved pieces around with her fingers, careful not to cut herself.
"When I hit her, she dropped something. If I remember, it was red."
Another few moments searching and she grabbed hold of an object, dusted it off, and held it aloft. The guards, proprietors, and Zelda all leaned in to look. It was a red orb about the size of Zelda's pinky nail.
Edison?
She asked.
Of a sort. Please step back for a moment.
Once they had, Paya placed the sphere on the open palm of her right hand.
Please forgive my impropriety.
Paya licked the tip of her left forefinger, then pressed it against the orb. Instantly there was a low hiss, and a wavering in the air above Paya's palm. Paya turned her face away and removed her finger. After a moment the hissing stopped, and the wavering in the air dissipated, and Paya turned to look at it again. She got to her feet, held out the orb for them to see again. There was a depression in its surface, precisely where Paya had touched it.
This,
Paya said,
is a special sort of medicine, perfectly harmless until its surface reacts with moisture. It's specially formulated so that it will not dissolve in water, sweat, or blood, only saliva.
She did not frown, though Zelda had expected she would.
Once placed in the mouth, it will vaporize into a gas that renders the victim unconscious for a period of time dependent on the dosage. It can last for days, but it's much safer to dose for a few hours.
Zelda stared at Paya. She felt as if her entire body had gone numb. The world kept moving around her as if nothing that they'd just heard mattered, and Zelda couldn't move with it.
So the Sheikh have tools like this, do you?
Isha said.
We did once,
Paya said, and offered no more than that. Now the guards stepped away from the wall, and the one who had approached first said,
So the Yiga was attempting to abduct you. We have no experience with them doing such a thing. They are assassins, not kidnappers. Why would they try to take you alive? We are freeing the divine beasts.
The voice came from Zelda's mouth, though she did not feel herself saying the words. Everyone stared at her now. She didn't feel that, either.
The Yiga seek to stymie our efforts. If possible, we would like to have an audience with the chief tomorrow.
Silence, for long moments. In that gap Paya reached among the glass, picked up the amber earrings, handed them to the stun-faced Isha.
You do not need an appointment to meet the chief,
the first guard said, at last.
There is a period of time around noon every day where she will speak to anyone who approaches her. If your goal is that lofty,
and her tone betrayed that she did not believe this,
then Chief Riju will be most interested in what you have to say.
The guards did not have many questions beyond that point. After the last were asked, and Isha's complaints were registered, Zelda and Paya were directed toward the inn. Isha told them to come back tomorrow for Zelda's circlet. Zelda asked Paya which of the jewelry she had decided on. Paya said the amber earrings. Zelda paid for them up front, and it was agreed that both accessories would be picked up in the morning. They made their way to the inn, rented a room, and refused the spa service, for now. They washed, dressed for bed. During all of this they did not speak. As she got under the covers of her bed, Zelda said,
Why did that woman try to grab you?
Paya had been in a quiet part of her mind for many hours. It had served as insulation against the fact of what she'd done that afternoon, the feel of the Yiga woman writhing and falling still. She couldn't keep it up forever, she knew, but she tried, hoping to avoid the worst of the shock and to keep from frightening Zelda or shaming herself. Zelda's question was so frank, so nearly plaintive, that it pulled Paya out of that place completely. She stared at the back of Zelda's head until the princess rolled over and stared right back at her with her enormous and enormously earnest blue eyes. She couldn't help but answer.
They know how dangerous I am,
Paya said.
They knew it would be hard to abduct me. Forgive me for my presumption, but... Do you mean to ask why they didn't try for you? No.
Zelda's forehead creased as she scowled.
After what happened on Death Mountain, they'd probably think I'm too dangerous to attempt to approach that way. What I mean is, what would they gain in your abduction?
Paya was quiet for a moment, then. She didn't think Zelda would use her senses now. The princess almost never did, when the conversation was so serious.
I believe they would have used me as a hostage, to lure you into some kind of trap. They do not know how far your holy awareness extends, but...
Here she stopped, looked at her charge, really looked, and felt something in her heart shift.
I know how hard it is to think of something nearly happening to someone close to you.
Zelda's voice was almost a croak.
I can't stop thinking about how close I came to never seeing you again.
Paya smiled, as best she could.
They know that your awareness extends further than the senses of your body. They couldn't risk hurting me, Delta. You would know if I died. And it didn't happen, did it? I'm here. We both are.
That Zelda was having this conversation at all spoke to the depth of her exhaustion. She nodded, but she kept staring at Paya, as if making sure she wouldn't disappear until sleep took her. Paya stared at her princess for a while longer. She thought about how her feelings for Zelda differed from Zelda's for her. Or if they did, now. She wasn't sure of herself, even. How could she be sure of anyone else? They needed to have that talk soon. She thought of how she needed to stop running. She thought of how much more at peace she'd be. How much easier these conversations would be. She thought of how easy it had been to lie to Zelda, just now. She thought of how the Yiga would have kept her alive. Yes, but they would have used her pain like a signal flare to draw Zelda in faster. She thought of the forbidden arts that she had read of in her grandmother's library. She thought of the old Zora sergeant who had known the history of the Sheikah. She thought of how different Yiga torture must have been after encountered generations. Paya took out her diary. She opened it to a fresh page. She placed her pen against the page. She hesitated. She thought of where the Yiga woman's body was, now. She thought of her sword, clean of blood, but not of violence. She thought of her hands. She thought of Zelda. She thought, and could not stop thinking. End of chapter.